back to our series, Behind Every Great Cook is a Great Mother. My name is Julia. I'm a member of the Culinary Historians of Canada board, and I am pleased to welcome today our host for this series, John Ota, who is the author of the best-selling book, The Kitchen, A Journey Through Time and the Homes of Julia Child, Georgia O'Keeffe, Elvis Presley, and many others in search of the perfect design. So John, I'm going to pass it over to you to introduce our guests.
Thank you, Julia. I'm so excited. This is great today. Thank you all for joining us for our Super Sunday Mother's Day edition of Behind Every Great Cook is a Great Mother. Our guests today are Michael Olsen, Naomi Duguid, and Vikram Vij. So our first guest today is Michael Olsen. Michael Olsen is a chef, educator, vintage deli slicer collector, barbecue aficionado. He lives in the Niagara region of Ontario with his wife, Anna. He's an enthusiastic student of food in addition to his role as a professor at the Niagara College Canadian Food and Wine Institute. He has co-authored 3 best-selling cookbooks, Living High Off the Hog, In on the 20 Cookbook, and Anna and Michael Olsen Cook at Home. His recently published cookbook, Living High Off the Hog, is a carnivore's love letter to one of the most versatile, affordable, and tasty types of meat, pork. Michael Olsen shares over 100 of his favorite pork recipes, from bacon, okonomiyaki, and schnitzel to low and slow barbecue. This is a fabulous book where you'll find recipes and learn techniques to cook the classics as well as new ideas for all cuts of pork. Michael, thank you for being here today.
Good morning.
Good morning.
That was Michael, a lengthy introduction.
Michael, could you please tell us about your mom and how she influenced your cooking career?
Yes. I grew up in a little place called Foam Lake, Saskatchewan. It was very much Leave It to Beaver. My father ran the local hardware store and knew everybody for, a 150 kilometer radius. And my mom, May, Max and May raised 7 kids. And no surprise to anyone who knows me, but I'm the baby of the family. And in fact, yesterday, every Saturday, all 7 of us get together for a Zoom meeting, and it looks like a bunch of gray-haired Brady Bunch kids on the screen. So we stay in touch, but I was very fortunate to have a really wonderful childhood that featured the kitchen as the center of all things that are good and warm and happy. And, my mom was not a fancy cook. This is her. She passed away in 2000, but she was just such a really warm, inviting, friendly person that I don't remember her ever having like lousy times. Like, she was just such a constant positive in my life. Whenever I came home, she was a homemaker. Dad was always at work, and there was always this, I suppose, unrealistic expectation that she was there, because I remember, of course, the doors were never locked. Whether I was coming home from school or a friend's house or hockey practice or something, I would open the door and just shout as loud as I could, "I'm home!" I would wait 1 or 2 seconds, and there was always this, "Hello!" And, like, it was just awesome, So yeah. When I think of the foods that we had, both of my folks came from Icelandic families that their parents had moved to Canada and eventually settled in Saskatchewan after setting up homesteads in Gimli, Manitoba. But we didn't speak the language, but around holiday times, there were always a handful of Icelandic dishes that, that had been adapted to the Canadian palate. So I still make her Icelandic brown bread, and it's a very simple whole wheat and rye bread with molasses. And you know how smell and memory are so deeply connected that as soon as I smell this, or her Vina Tarta, the prune cardamom cake, or the Rulapilsa, I smell that, and I'm 5 years old wearing flannel PJs with cowboys on them, and it's Christmas, and everything is good. So there were a handful of things that were sort of connected to her past, but by and large, it was pretty simple, straightforward things that were available to us. So, you know, I grew up, I was born in '64, so I grew up in a time before families really went out to restaurants very much. So there were always meals at home, homemade soups, but there would be, you know, Campbell's cream of tomato. There's no shame in that. And she would do a blend of making her own and using some convenience products. There was, I think you call it a Hoosier, but we used to just call it the flour bin, but it was one of those lean-to, you know, big, huge bins, and she did all of her baking. So there was a distinct baking part of the kitchen and a cooking part of the kitchen. And actually, my wife and I almost have that now, where we have the baking area set up here, and then I do my thing here, because when Anna and I cook, we carry on that tradition that I got so early, which is the kitchen is just where it all starts, and we have our best laughs and our best talks happen while we're cooking together in the kitchen.
Bravo, bravo. Michael, I wish we could talk about your mom all day. I'd love to hear it. I'd also like to hear about your cookbook.
Yes.
Living High Off the Hog. So you went all out with pork on this. I love pork. Can you please tell us about your book and also about pork alecki pie? Leaky. Oh, leaky pie. Okay.
I originally pitched an idea of being a guide to people who were struggling in choosing and preparing cuts of meat. And so the working title was called A Look Through the Butcher Shop Window. And our publisher, Robert McCullough, came back and said, you know, I love it, but why don't we focus on one topic rather than the whole butcher shop? And my notion was, if people go to the supermarket or to their favorite butcher shop, if they don't want to take a chance with something and they just do the same recipes week in and week out, I wanted to be that guide that said, no, you can do this. You can choose that different cut. And I don't mean whole animal nose to tail. I mean, like, a lot of people are only comfortable with sausage and tenderloin. So I've brought in that perspective. And I've tried to make it realistic. There are a couple of adventurous things, but most of them are very approachable. The one you mentioned, the pork alecki pie. I'm just
good.
It's a savory meat pie that has pork hocks and hard-boiled eggs and lots of leeks. And part of it was, I was having dinner with Robert one time, and we were saying how much we loved the flavor of leeks. And my first reaction as a cook was to say, well, you know, people don't use them that often because they're such a pain in the neck to clean because they always have sand in it. And as soon as I said that, I thought, what a defeatist attitude. Like, wash them. They're so delicious. It's worth the effort. And it's not a lot of work. And so just sort of from that simple stem of listening to somebody's opinion and putting it forward into a dish, it's one of the more adventurous recipes in the book, but it's so well worth the effort that it's something that I would do for a holiday where you have, you know, meals spanning, you know, several days. And at some point we are going to be back together with family and friends. I mean, we're all living in our bubble right now, but there will be a day where we will share the table and break bread, and there will be laughter that doesn't come through devices. It'll come from the human mouth across the table. So that's definitely a dish that I would do for a gang, not for two people.
Great, thank you. So Michael, you're a professor at Niagara College. What do you try to instill in your students about cooking and food?
You know, John, I think that, you know, when you look at what education is, you have to cover a lot of outcomes that satisfy industry norms, but there's still a place for basic foundational things that include, you know, good manners and standing up straight, arriving on time, bright-eyed and ready to work and contribute and get engaged. And I really try to focus on the most simple things. I focus on first year courses, and it's how to set up a station, how to organize your day, to write lists, to be very clear in your communications, to understand how not to waste food, how to look after food, keep your kitchen clean, because every chef that one of the cooks works for will have an impact on their life. And I'm not saving lives or teaching them everything. I'm just getting them excited and developing passion that they can put towards learning on their own, because in the end, everybody has their own version of what success is. I may have one student who wants to be the executive chef of the biggest Marriott in Miami, Florida. I may also have another chef or another student that has an ambition of getting a job that pays their rent. And I respect both of those opinions.
Great, thank you very much. Our next guest is Naomi Duguid. Naomi Duguid is a traveler, writer, and photographer, and is often described as a culinary anthropologist. She's published 8 award-winning cookbooks, including Seductions of Rice and Mangoes and Curry Leaves. All of her books are epic, magnificent. I love to get lost in them. And during the pandemic, they also work very well as a home gym. Her latest book is Taste of Persia. Can you please tell us about your mom and how she affected your career?
She died a long time ago. I warned you I might cry because it's, emotional. Not that she's dead. I'd be crying if she was alive. I mean, our connection is so visceral, right? And so that's what makes food so important, because the smell of food and home and mother. Anyway, my mother was raised by immigrants from a mixture of France and England in northern British Columbia in a log house with no electricity or running water. And she was an identical twin. And so raised during the Depression, so my granddad shot a moose every year and all of that. So in the war, she was in the Navy as a physio. She was a frugal person. There was always plenty of food on the table and so on, but she was a waste not, want not person. And so it wasn't about performance. She just, of course, automatically made all her own bread. Everything was made at home, made damson jam and orange marmalade and those kinds of things. And one of the things that early on, I was always afraid of fire and heat, the oven, all of that. But early on, my brother and I had one brother, a younger brother. We'd come home from school and we'd see a note from her. She might be out treating a patient because she did this freelance physio, saying, the breads, I've put the bread to rise, turn the oven on and get it in the oven by, 4:15. Or shape the loaves and put it in loaves. And she baked her bread in, she had a few bread tins that were regular, but most of them were Allen's apple juice tins before they put those bumpies on it. Now when you pick up a round tin of juice, it's got bumpies so that it doesn't slide through your fingers. Yeah. But the early ones were just a straight cylinder. And so our bread was always whole grain and, again, not self-consciously so, but it was with maybe a little molasses or a bit of oats or some leftover porridge in it. And it was round. And then the sandwiches were, of course, when I took them to school, were weird because they were round. The bread was brown. Everybody else was eating white bread. And the only time that we had white bread was at Christmas. She would make turkey. Absolutely not my favorite thing to eat, but never mind. And she would make the stuffing. And to make the stuffing, she'd go and buy a loaf of that, plastic stuff, white bread. And for my brother and I, this was this huge treat. Wow, we get to eat this. So why did she buy it? Well, I'm not going to waste my good bread on stuffing. So she'd buy the crap bread anyway. So it was just this amazing thing. We spread butter on this stuff that, that cushiony, weird texture. And it was the big treat, but most of the time bread was actual food. And so that's what I was raised with. And so for me, when I got to university, I was in Kingston, and in my 4th year, I was living out, and I thought, oh, I should be able to make bread. And I pieced together the bits. I'd sometimes start at the yeast. She used to do a slow rise. She'd let it rise overnight. And so I'd start the yeast. I started the yeast, and I thought, well, what's the next thing? And I kept thinking as I was doing it, have I left something out? Was there something in between that I never got to do? So I sort of, okay, then the next thing, all right, mix it roughly, okay, about that amount of salt. And of course it worked, it was, and I made decent bread first time around, but it was all from these things that, I hadn't actually lived at home at that point for 5 years. I hadn't been in on any of that for 5 years. And so for me, when people say, well, for example, right now, everybody's sourdough baking. I'm the only person I know who's a person who's worked a lot with bread, who is not baking at all. Because why would I? I have a very good friend who's a baker here, and I buy her bread. She is a sourdough baker. Evelyn's Crackers is the business. And first of all, I want to support her, but secondly, her bread is so fabulous. I've done it. I've made the bread all the time my kids were growing up. I made the bread, and I have a picture to show you for fun, which is in my book, Home Baking. And it's a picture of I don't know if you can see this, of my younger kid, who's now, 29 years old and 6'2", but there he is. Can you see him in the bowl? He's in the bowl of dough. And that's my counter. And that's as we were working on recipes for the home baking book. So that was sort of how I grew up too. Although mostly she would have said, out of there,
Can you please tell us about Taste of Persia?
My notion when I proposed the book to my editor, Anne Bramston at Artisan, was I said, well, here's the thing. There's a Persian culinary region. And of course, the extent of it is even larger because the Persian influence extends into all the Mughal dishes in India and all the way down to Hyderabad. But in a close context, the Persian culinary region, I said to her, Iran, the Kurds in Iraq, and then the Caucasus countries, Georgia, Armenia, and Azerbaijan. And she said, she's in New York, right? She said, that sounds really complicated. and I realized, well, because there's no big ocean defining where those things are, it's kind of that place in the map, Iran or Iraq, which is which comes first? People just had no clue. So I said, well, of course, as an author, you're always trying to make headway on the things you want. I said, well, then we need maps, right? We need maps in the book. So there's 2 maps in the book. So then I would go out on tour with the book and I'd say, well, if you picture there's the Caspian Sea and there's the Black Sea. Yeah. And then it's basically the space in between is the Caucasus Mountains. And so below the Caucasus is this Garden of Eden that's Georgia, Armenia, and Azerbaijan. And then below that is this big teardrop shape, which is Iran. And the Kurds in Iraq are right along the Iranian border. The flavors, you've got tart fruits, fabulous tart fruits. So, and again, all of this goes into some of Vij's repertoire because you've got like pomegranate molasses and tart anardana in various ways. And tart fruits of all kinds with savory dishes. And that penetrated in medieval times because those flavors penetrated into the Mediterranean after the Arab conquest of Iran. So those went all the way with the Crusaders up into England, and that gives you mint sauce with your lamb in England. And, so it's really, but for me, this is the heartland. This is an origin place of a lot of combinations that we still, that taste of not home, but of something familiar that speak to us. Apart from being delicious, there's also kind of a note that catches us and is familiar to anybody who's grown up anywhere from India to Northern Europe. It's an enormous spread of influence, and into Central Asia as well. Those cross connections over time are just so fascinating to me.
Your books take place in Asia. What is it about Asia?
There's this huge continent, and again, this flow of people. Islands have never interested me. It's the cross connections, the cross communications over time, and the fact that food is dynamic. And when you're in India, when you're anywhere where people are living off what they have there, you have people who understand what goes into their food. And so there's a connectedness. So as an outsider, you're never going to be a master of that cuisine, but you can appreciate it. And there's always something to learn. And the place you have the most to learn is in the home kitchens at the hearth of people who work with very few ingredients and do brilliant things with them. I mean, there's nothing harder to make than a perfect chapati. Anyone can make a chapati, absolutely. But to make a perfect chapati that a mother-in-law is not going to yell at you for, nah. You know, and that's a wonderful, amazing, humbling thing. And that we all need to sort of bow down before the home cooks who are absolutely the absolute heroines. And I'm going to say heroines because it's mostly the mother. They're the heroines of the world, that they feed people every day. And so Mother's Day is actually every day we need to be saying, thank you, thank you, thank you for all of that imagination and just survival skills to make people enough food that they survive. I mean, it's really extraordinary.
Thank you. That's beautiful. The next guest is Vikram Vij in Vancouver. Vikram Vij was born in the Punjab in India. In 1983, he left India to study hotel management in Salzburg, Austria, where he received his chef's training. He moved to Canada and opened the original 14-seat Vij's restaurant in 1994. Today, he's co-owner with Meera Dawala of Vij's Restaurant and Rangoli Restaurant in Vancouver. He also owns My Shanty in South Surrey, BC. Vij and Dawala collaborated on 2 cookbooks, Vij's Elegant and Inspired Indian Cuisine. In 2010, they published Vij's at Home, Relax Honey. Vikram Vij is simply one of the best known and respected chefs in Canada. Can you please tell us about your mom and the influence she had on your career?
My mom was a very gentle human being. My father was always the disciplinarian one, and my mom was always the gentle one. I think the only time my mom has ever raised her hand on me was I had a pellet gun, and instead of shooting a target, I got upset with some friend of mine, and I shot him with a pellet gun. And the whole community came to my house, and my mom is such a gentle person. She heard what happened, and for the first time she actually took out a belt and beat me with it because she was so afraid that they were going to go to the cops and I was going to be put away with it. Other than that, 55 years have gone by. She has been the most gentle, understanding, and a beautiful human being, and I owe everything to her.
What sorts of things did you eat growing up? What did she make? What did you make? Did you cook with her?
Yeah, we did. I mean, you know, my mom's a very simple cook, right? She cooks the shit out of everything. Like, you never know whether you're eating an eggplant, a potato, or a chicken. And I tell my mom this. I say, Mom, what did you make? She's like, Array, what happened to your taste buds? I made chicken curry. And I'll be like, you have lost all nutritional value of this chicken curry. Because in India at that time, there was nothing called as refrigeration. So you had to cook everything through and through. Only when I came to North America would you say, oh, let's, you know, keep the marbling or keep the color or keep all these, you know, the nuances of lamb chops, for example. So she cooks very simple food. Her food, even though now I go and eat, I have to add lots of salt to it because it just isn't robust enough for my palate. Whereas she cooked the food for my father, who hates anything. Salt and pepper and turmeric and ginger and garlic are the only, he hates red chili in it, in Indian food. And so she cooks for him, and we cook together a lot, but I was very territorial, so I loved my space and she loved her space. So she would make 3 things and I would make 1 small thing. But what I loved doing was when people came over to the house, I was always the one who would set the table up, who was always the performer at the table in the kitchen, and, you know, come up and say hello to all the aunties that they would come over, and I was the charmer. Whereas my sister would just hide in the room. So it was a total opposite. In Indian culture, the woman is supposed to be going out and talking to everybody else, and the man is supposed to just kind of stay back. And I was the one who was always naughty and playing with the aunts and everything else. And my sister would just hide. She hates people, and I love people. but my mother accepted that about us and never forced her to learn to either make a chapati or to do anything else.
Great. We've talked earlier a little bit about when you first opened in Vancouver and the role that your mother played with the chicken curries.
Yeah, well, the kitchen was very small. It was 16 seat. It was electric stove. The hood wasn't proper. And so everybody used to complain about the aromas of Indian food. I mean, today people say, oh, wow, it smells great. But at that time in 1994, Indian food was not perceived as a cuisine of mainstream. So my mother and my father would make a chicken curry home in Richmond, and then she would put a pot of this chicken curry with a little plastic bag on top of it, put it between her legs, and come from Richmond to Vancouver to serve that curry at the restaurant. Because as an immigrant, she wanted to serve the best Indian food for the country where I was going to live, the democracy that I was going to live
But
in.
she brought it on the bus, is that
She
right?
brought it on the bus, and she didn't tell me for the longest time that everybody would look at her, this crazy Indian woman, 4 feet tall, with a pot of chicken curry between her legs, and the whole bus smelled of Indian food, But I owe it to her because that was the chicken curry that the first food writer, Robin Mines, ate, and she loved it, and she wrote a review about it. And all these years have gone by, and here we are talking to everybody else. But before I had left India, my grandmother went to a temple. They knew that I was going to go to Austria. And she gave me this little coin that you can see. It's just a $1 coin. And I made it into a ring. And she told me to put it in my pocket ever and hold it because it'll bring me luck. And look where we are. At the age of 55, I get to hang out with Michael Olsen and Naomi and Julia and you, and get to talk about life and culture and food.
Oh, isn't that nice? My goodness. When I go to Vancouver, I always go to your restaurant on Cambie Street. And I love going there. The food is sensational, but also there's a really strong feeling of hospitality.
Mm-hmm.
Your staff is so gracious. They cannot do enough for me when I visit. The atmosphere is beautiful. And again, the food is sensational. How do you develop that kind of atmosphere and maintain that hospitality?
We've never run it as restaurants. We've never worried about how many covers do you do, what kind of numbers do you produce. We've always run it as a village. Like, you come to my house, I'm going to take care of you. So when you come into the restaurant, you get a cup of chai and something savory. We can attest to this. Every household in India, when you go to, it doesn't matter how rich you are, doesn't matter how poor you are, they will offer you at least a cup of tea. They would offer you something savory to munch on. And so that's what I instilled in the restaurant, because that's why it's called Vij's. It's not called Cuisine of India. It's not called Taj Mahal. It's called Vij's. You come to my house and I'm going to take care of you through the Vij's hospitality. So that is what we wanted to create. And something that I learned, 2 years ago, I was invited by a defense minister to cook for our troops. I got a chance to go to HMCS Charlottetown. And on the ship, I was, they were doing the NATO exercises, and on the helicopter, and I was, being dangled on top of the ocean, and they were like, obviously doing all these things. And we just lost this men and women, which I want to show you. One of the gentlemen that is marked, his name is Matthew Cousins. We lost him in the fatal crash of the helicopter was there. But again, when I was on that ship, I was given the same love and hospitality that I give to the people. The love that I got on the ship was, I went back so moved that everybody talked to me, everybody, welcomed me with their open arms. And so those are things that you learn, and those are things that you instill on your staff and onto the people that come into your restaurant, that walk into your restaurant.
Outstanding. Thank you, Vij.
My pleasure.
Julia, do we have any questions from the audience?
Yes, we do. The first question we have is for Michael. You mentioned an Icelandic dish that is I believe, a rolled spice veal dish. Could you talk a little more about that?
Rulapilsa was something that we would have at Christmas, and it was my mom and dad would make it with beef flank. Originally, it would have been done with lamb in Iceland, but of course, you know, when people leave their home country, they take a snapshot of cuisine with them, and it'll either remain or develop a little bit. And of course, you have to make do with what you have, and it's served cold. It's like a chilled rouladen, a lot of onions. So they would butterfly the flank and put a lot of clove, black pepper, onions, let it marinate. It would be rolled up and tied, then poached. And then for several days, even up to a week, it would be pressed in a weight in the refrigerator. And then when you'd go to slice it, it would go on to the requisite brown bread with butter and salt. And I was at a family reunion a couple of years ago when one of my cousins brought it out. And you would think that he was handing out caviar and diamonds and lobster. It was just the most incredible scent for everybody. And I realized many years later that part of the reason that we never used lamb, I thought it was a supply issue. There was plenty of lamb where we grew up. My father was in World War II, and he was in the Royal Canadian Air Force, and the only meat they ever ate was mutton. And it was because of the conditions that these soldiers lived in, the food was pretty awful, and he never wanted to eat lamb for the rest of his life. But when he was in his later years, I was cooking at a restaurant in Toronto, and I actually served him lamb chops, and it was just such a personal victory for me because he loved it. And I thought, man, you can teach an old dog new tricks. Here's Max loving the lamb chops at 75 years old and just grooving to it.
Wonderful. That's wonderful. Naomi, we have a question for you. What region are you investigating now?
Oh, I'm investigating the region of necessity. So I'm working on a book that I have provisionally titled Joy of Salt. And so it's about salt preserved ingredients. So how to make salt preserved ingredients, from corned beef to salt pork to herbes salées in Acadia to oignons salés in Acadia, I should say, herbes salées in Quebec. Lots of things all over, fish sauce and so on. Some of them how to make them, some of them just how to use them. So salt is the only ingredient we have to eat. It's very exciting actually to be at the basics. So it isn't, it's the region of necessity. That's where I am.
Beautiful.
Yeah. Question for Vikram Vij. From your cookbooks, which recipes do you associate with your mother and grandmother and comfort food from your childhood? Are any of them inspired by a taste you remember from that time?
Right. So obviously in the first cookbook, there is a recipe called Vikram's or Vij's family chicken curry. That was the chicken curry that my mom used to make in Richmond and bring it down. There is a really sweet dessert that my mom used to make called meaty roti, which is like a piece of bread with little sugar and cashews in it. So as a young child, when you're growing up, obviously whole wheat is not something that your palate is used to. So how do you get the child to start enjoying the ingredients of whole wheat is by putting a little bit of sugar in it, and then it would taste sweet. So it's almost like a little candy, like a little honey in it, and little nuts to give you that energy that you needed. Because we come from a land where, especially I grew up in northern India, which is Punjab, where there was a lot of milk, where there was a lot of nuts. You know, the influence of Persia was a huge influence in our style of cooking. So, she would make that. So there's one called meaty roti. Then there is another one called saag paneer, which is saag is mustard greens, slow cooked, broccoli raab basically, chopped up, slow cooked with cornmeal chapati. So there are so many great recipes, home cooked recipes. The beautiful part about Indian food is that it is a democracy. There's no one way to say it, that it is exactly the way it is. It's like a little bit of this, a little bit of this, and a little bit of that makes this. Of course, salt is one thing. I was just in Kerala last 2 months ago, and I went to these beautiful fields of Kerala where they actually use sea salt. And I brought like 1 kilo of sea salt from there. And it's unbelievable how delicious it is. And it's not the fleur de sel style of it. It's just big granules of salt. And they're used for pickling, exactly what you said, achars. And
achars,
pickles, is a big, huge part of cooking with salt.
But you out there in Vancouver, on Vancouver Island, sea salt is one of the most delicious. They're getting it from the straits between the Vancouver Island and the mainland, and wow, it's so good. Yeah,
it's wonderful. We have time for one final question, and I'm going to ask each of you to answer it, starting with Michael. What do you think the most important thing is that parents can pass down to their children about food and cooking, and any advice about teaching them and getting them into the kitchen?
I always encourage people to get their kids into the kitchen as a basic survival kit, because if you're 16 or 18 or 20 years old and you can't even make a salad or a sandwich, you're just not well equipped for anything, for being social, for surviving, through getting through lean times. I just think basic cooking is such a gift that parents should pass on to their kids.
Right. Naomi?
I always encourage parents to not have fights about food with their kids. I think the most important thing is not to turn food or the dinner table into a battleground. And so I had kids who, one didn't like this, one didn't like that. I never sweated about that. They'll be fine. So there was always a pot of rice, some dal usually, and then a couple of other things. And this one doesn't like onions. I don't care. He's not going to eat that dish. I don't care. I couldn't care less. So to never care and never be focused on, oh, is he eating okay? Screw that. It's not important. The important thing is that it be a place where you can relax and have pleasure. You're never going to win a food fight with your kid. So don't even start. And if you do that and you just say, I need you to taste this, and you may not like it, but have a taste. They eventually, one of them said at 6, said, it's strange, but after you taste something 3 times, sometimes you like it. And I said to him, there's adults who have never learned this fact. But if it's a fight, they're never going to try. So that's my big advice to parents.
Wow.
Love it.
And Vikram Vij?
My biggest advice is let your kids eat food from all parts of the world. So if you eat there, make sure you eat one day Chinese food, and one day Vietnamese food, and one day Indian, and one day food from France or wherever it is. Because cuisines and music will solve the problems of the world. Not the guns, and definitely not the politics. When you break bread with your family, when you break bread with people of different cultures, different countries, you build tolerances towards each other. Food should be the medium of building tolerances towards each other. It should not be something that people have to, talk about it too much. Don't fuss over it.
Don't fuss over it. Yeah.
Just enjoy food from all over the world.
Wonderful advice.
Wonderful.
Thank you so much.
Yeah.
Thank you everyone for your questions. And I'll pass it back to John now.
Thank you, Julia. I knew this was going to be great, but I didn't know it was going to be this great. On behalf of the Culinary Historians of Canada and Julia Armstrong, I would like to thank Michael Olsen, yay, Naomi Duguid, yay, and Vikram Vij, yay, for being here today and sharing your thoughts and your sentiments about your moms. In the meantime, let's all please stay well, stay strong, and happy cooking. Thank you.